Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. If you can hear my voice, then you are in perfect shape, and we will begin in 2 minutes. We will be beginning in 1 minute, everyone. We are so excited you're here to join us. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mariel Milano, and I am the director for Parent and Family Engagement with Orange County Public Schools, and I'm excited to welcome you tonight to our virtual Parent Academy on finding money for college. Our presenter this evening is going to be the fabulous Dr. Mansell from the University of Central Florida, who will be sharing invaluable information with you about how to prepare and pay for college. So I'm going to turn it over to her. If you are in need of closed captioning, please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen and feel free to chat any of your questions at any time in the chat box. We'll be watching. Have a great time.
Thank you so much. So good evening, everyone. I am going to jump right in and start talking about financial aid and helping your student find money for college. And tonight's presentation will definitely be a learning experience. And I always like to start with key financial aid terms because I think that this process is a process that you'll be going through each and every year that your student is a student in college. So while you're getting this presentation tonight, I wanted to make sure I give you some foundation so that you can move forward through this process annually. So I'd like to start with the FAFSA. The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It is the form that most colleges utilize to determine a student's need. It is the form required to determine a student's financial aid eligibility for federal financial aid programs, including the federal Pell Grant and federally funded student loans. Many schools only utilize the FAFSA in terms of determining a student's eligibility for financial aid, but some schools do have institutional applications. Some schools use the CSS profile. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I want to make sure that everybody knows about the FAFSA and everybody completes the FAFSA each and every year. And so when you do the FAFSA, you're going to get a number, and that number is called the expected family contribution. That number is going to be created by the Department of Education based on the information provided on the FAFSA, and it determines the monetary contribution a family can make to contribute to a student's education. And so that number is a really important number because it helps to determine the type of aid for which a student qualifies. So depending on a student's expected family contribution, that will determine if the student is Pell Grant eligible for federal grant programs, or if the student has other state grant eligibility here in the state of Florida. It also helps us to determine a student's need. So the expected family contribution is a very important number. It's the number that you're going to get when you complete the FAFSA. It can be as low as 0 and it can go up into 999,000. So it really just depends on the information that you have provided, and then that number will be derived by the Department of Education. Each school creates what they call a cost of attendance or a budget. The cost of attendance is going to be based on a student's enrollment, residency, and housing status if we're talking about public institutions such as our state universities or our state colleges. At private institutions, residency is normally not a factor. They take into account enrollment and housing status. When the cost of attendance is important because it's important for students and families to start to look at the actual cost to attend specific institutions. And it does vary greatly from one school to the next. The cost of attendance is based on a variety of different educational expenses. So tuition and fees are kind of a given, but other factors go into the cost of attendance as well. Room and board, food, transportation to and from school. Those are all different ways or different components of the cost of attendance. So when you're looking at what it costs your student to go to school, you want to look at that number holistically. Tuition is just one of those factors. So why these two numbers are really important is that the cost of attendance is one of the factors that helps a school to determine if a student has need at that particular institution. And so they take the expected family contribution, they subtract it from the cost of attendance to determine if there is need at that particular school. And that, depending on the school that the student is going to, it may be a factor in the type of institutional aid the student can receive at that particular school. Each school has established what they call a priority filing date. So the priority filing date is the date that that school would like its students to complete the FAFSA for maximum consideration of financial aid. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee any specific awards, but there are many programs, both institutional, state, and federal, that are limited. And so in order to be fair and equitable in the distribution of these limited funds, most schools have established a priority filing date. At UCF, our date is December 1st. And I actually have a slide to share some of the other partner institutions throughout the state and what their priority filing dates are. So I do recognize, are you all not able to hear? I just saw someone come through. Ms. Milano, are you hearing?
Yeah, they can hear. There's a
Okay.
few people that had some challenges, but we're giving them the call-in number.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure everyone can hear me. So when a student has to borrow to assist with their educational expenses, there are two types of federal loans available to students, and that's the subsidized loan. The subsidized loan is only available to those students who have need after their other resources are taken into account. And what makes the subsidized loan a really great option for students if they do need to borrow is that the government does pay the interest on behalf of the student. The unsubsidized loan is available to students regardless of the expected family contribution. The unsubsidized loan, a student does not have to have need in order to receive this loan as a part of their financial aid package. However, the interest does begin accruing once the loan disperses. If a student has a financial aid package that includes both the subsidized and the unsubsidized loan, we ask our students to please take the subsidized loan first before tapping into the unsubsidized loan because it is the better loan for them. So there's this terminology in financial aid, and I just like to break it down to families what it means. We refer to utilizing tax information from the prior year. I promise you, I didn't come up with that. It came from the Federal Department of Education. And what the prior year essentially means is that we're going to use tax information from 2 years ago in order to complete the FAFSA at that time. I do have a slide that's going to show what year tax information you use. So just some tips on completing the FAFSA. The FAFSA becomes available on October 1st of each year. So the 23-24 FAFSA is already out. It has to be completed annually. It is not a one-time form. It is an annual form that becomes available on October 1st. You can request a paper FAFSA. We don't really recommend that you do that. However, if you really want to, you can contact the Federal Department of Education. Our recommendation is that you complete the FAFSA on the web at FAFSA.gov. Both students and parents will need what we call an FSA ID, a Federal Student Aid ID. That's going to allow you to sign the FAFSA electronically. It's also going to ask about parental and student demographic and financial information. And ultimately, it is the form we use to determine student financial aid eligibility. So as I mentioned before, the FAFSA becomes available on October 1st of each year. So there's no need to wait. You have your student's information with you. You can go ahead and get the FAFSA done this weekend. So you want to go ahead and get it done as soon as possible because as I mentioned before, each school does have their own priority filing date. So just sharing with you what the application process looks like when you are looking to file the FAFSA, you want to get all the documents you need, and I have a slide that's going to tell you everything you need in order to complete the FAFSA. You're going to go ahead and complete it online and complete it as early as possible. One of the tips I'll give you is that our seniors in high school, they're actually really good at getting the FAFSA done early. They're getting encouraged from their guidance counselors at high school. They're getting encouraged from a variety of different sources. You're still right there and holding their hand through the process. But what we find is in subsequent years, students don't do the FAFSA as promptly as they do in their senior year. So I would encourage your student to always apply early to maximize their consideration for financial aid. When you do the FAFSA, the student is going to get a student aid report. The student aid report is basically the output the student gets from the information inputted on the FAFSA. It's going to share with the student the type of aid for which the student may qualify. It's also going to include some other information. If you find any, I'm going to tell you where to get the FSA ID in a moment. If you find any information on there that is not correct, you can always visit studentaid.gov or FAFSA.gov and make corrections to the information that you inputted on the FAFSA. Once schools that your student is interested in attending start to receive the information from the FAFSA and your student has been admitted to those institutions, we send out what we call either financial aid summaries or offer letters, and what they share is the type of aid that a student will be eligible to receive at a particular institution. So that's the information that the student gets back. And then you want to ensure that you do everything that that school is telling you to do to receive your aid in a prompt and timely manner. And so that could be additional documentation may be required. If you're a student loan borrower, you do have to sign a promissory note and do your entrance counseling. So you want to take all the steps. And then each and every year you want to renew your FAFSA. I do see questions coming through asking if the FAFSA can be completed in junior year. And no, the FAFSA should be completed to prepare your student for admission for college. So you complete the FAFSA based on the year the student is entering college. So for example, the October 1st FAFSA that launched is for the 23-24 academic year. So that's for the upcoming academic year. So you will need a FSA ID. The FSA ID identifies you and is personally identifiable, and you want to treat it like any other personally identifiable information. And so you want to protect that. You don't share your FSA ID information with anyone. That's how you sign the FAFSA electronically. Students have their own, parents have their own. Parents, if you've ever done a FAFSA for a student prior, or if you've ever done a FAFSA yourself in recent years and you already have an FSA ID, you use that same FSA ID over and over again. Our students, because it's their first go around, will need to apply for an FSA ID. They can do so at studentaid.gov. When they do that, they're going to go ahead and apply for their own account. They will need their social security number. I know a lot of students don't utilize that as much as we used to. So students do need to know their social security number, and they need their own unique either mobile number or email address in order to create their FSA ID. So this is the information on when the FAFSA becomes available and for what aid year that FAFSA is applicable. So the FAFSA that became available last year, October 1st of 2021, is for the current academic year, the 22-23 year. The reason why I kept that FAFSA on this slide is because if you have a student who is starting in the summer of 2023, if they're going to UCF or Valencia or some other schools in the state in the summer of 2023, many schools, summer 2023 is a part of the 22-23 aid year. So what that would mean is that that student would need to do the 22-23 FAFSA as well as the 23-24 FAFSA. So the 23-24 FAFSA opened a little under a week ago. It is going to be for the 23-24 year, depending on where your student is going to school. It could be fall through summer of 2024, so fall 2023, spring 2023, spring 2024, summer 2024. Some schools use summer as a header, so it would start summer 2023, fall 2023, 2024. It really depends on the institution. The vast majority of schools that I'm aware of use summer as a trailer. So 2023, 2024 typically starts fall 2023 unless that school uses summer as a header. I hope that didn't confuse you, but it really depends on the school as to when the financial aid year starts. And then just to give you an example of the tax year you'll be using for students entering or continuing for the 24-25 year, they will do their FAFSA as early as October 1st, 2023 for the 24-25 year using 2022 tax information. And so we know that our students are digital natives who always have their phones in hand. So the FAFSA is available on the web as well as by way of their mobile device. There's so many things that a student can do through the FAFSA mobile app or the My Student Aid mobile app. So I would encourage your students to download that because it's really a useful tool for the students. So as you prepare to complete the FAFSA, you want to gather all your documentation. If you're a pen and paper type of person, you can print the FAFSA on the web worksheet that will allow you to kind of map out what you're going to put on the FAFSA. I can't speak today. You want to make sure that you have an FSA ID. Just a reminder, both students and parents need one. And we would encourage you to sign your FSA ID. Sign your FAFSA utilizing your FSA ID. But you do have the option to sign the FAFSA with a wet signature. You'll have to print the signature page and mail it into the Department of Education. That does delay the processing of the FAFSA. So again, our recommendation is that you use your FSA ID and sign it electronically. And then you want to make note of any important dates, and there are quite a few. And so I mentioned that each school has their own FAFSA priority filing date. UCF is December 1st, as you see here. But some of our state partners have different dates. Our state colleges tend to have later dates. So our Valencias, our Seminoles, our Brevard, Eastern Florida, all of those schools typically have a little bit later because they do have a different admissions process, but you want to make sure that the FAFSA is done as early as possible to meet the school of interest that has the earliest priority filing date. So UCS is December 1st, FSU is December 1st, UF is December 15th, USF is January 1st, FAMU is January 1st, and FIU is March 1st. So you just want to, and those are just some, I just wanted to give you an idea, and they do vary. You can definitely, any school that your student is interested in attending, their financial aid website should share with you the priority filing date. Again, I'm just going to reiterate that you want to file by the school of interest that has the earliest priority filing date. So when you're completing the FAFSA, you want to make sure you have everything you need. And our students do need a valid Social Security number in order to file the FAFSA. So students must have a valid Social Security number in order to file the FAFSA. However, parents don't. So parents can file the FAFSA using zeros for the Social Security number. If a parent is not a permanent resident of the United States or not a citizen of the United States, that is fine. The parent can complete the FAFSA using all zeros. Furthermore, we want to make sure that parents know that, and that's something that isn't required. But for a student must have a valid Social Security number and be either an eligible citizen, a citizen or an eligible non-citizen in order to file the FAFSA. When it comes to other things you may need, your state issued ID, your permanent resident card, if applicable, W-2 forms for income tax return, records of any child support paid, records of taxable earnings from federal work study, if that's applicable, as well as anything earned from AmeriCorps, if that's applicable, your current investments, your stocks, your bonds, and other investment records, your current business and farm records, if that's applicable, as well as your current bank statements. So these are all the types of things that you're going to need in order to complete the FAFSA. And also remember that you are going to need your PIN in order to log. So I'm going to go over really quickly the different sections of the FAFSA just so that if this is your first time, you know what to expect. So the first section is going to be student demographic information. It's going to ask for name, telephone number, address, Social Security number, and so forth. And the student must be either a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, as I mentioned before. And as an eligible non-citizen are students who are a U.S. permanent resident or students who fall into one of these categories. And those are students who are on an arrival departure record I-94, students who have the following designations: refugees, asylee granted, parolee, students who hold T visas, and our Cuban Haitian entrants are all students who would qualify for financial aid based on an eligible non-citizenship status. When the FAFSA asked about the marital status in this particular section, the FAFSA is asking about the marital status of the student. So the student wants to make sure they answer that correctly. However, I do want to mention that when the FAFSA does ask about the marital status of parents, step-parents and step-parent financial information must be included. So after the student's demographic information, the student is going to input their financial information. We do recognize, particularly for many of our students who are just graduating from high school, that the FAFSA is requesting information that they may not have, particularly from 2 years ago. So if the student doesn't have income or other assets or anything like that, that's okay. You just make sure that you indicate zeros in those financial sections and move forward to the parent section. And so that goes back to, what is a dependent student for financial aid purposes? For financial aid purposes, a student is going to be dependent based on the questions they ask on the FAFSA. And those questions pertain to the student's age. Students who are 24 or older are considered independent for financial aid purposes. Students who are married are considered independent for financial aid purposes. Students who are in graduate programs, so they've already earned their bachelor's degree and they're in a master's or higher program, those students are considered independent for financial aid purposes. Any student who is active duty or a veteran of our U.S. military is considered independent for financial aid purposes. Any student who has dependents for whom the student provides more than half of the dependent support is considered independent for financial aid purposes. If a student falls into one of these categories, they would also be considered independent for financial aid purposes if both of the student's parents are deceased, if the student was in foster care or deemed a ward of the court anytime after the age of 13, the student is independent. If the student is an emancipated minor or in a legal guardianship, the student is considered independent, or if the student is homeless or at risk for homelessness as determined by the county's homeless youth liaison, then that student could be considered independent for financial aid purposes. So these are a variety of categories that make a student independent. We do recognize there are times when a student doesn't fall neatly into one of these categories, but may have a more complicated situation. In those cases, I'll talk a little bit later about a special circumstance process that each school has. When it comes to the FAFSA, a parent is very specific. Parents are either a biological or adoptive parent. So it is very specific in that sense. We do recognize, again, that there may be some other types of familial situations where there is a member of the family who is acting in a parental role, but may not be the student's biological or adoptive parent. If the student is in a legal guardianship, then the student will answer yes to the legal guardianship question. If it is not a legal guardianship, that's when the special circumstance comes into play. If parents are divorced or separated, foreign students will be utilizing the parent with whom they lived with for the vast majority of the 12 months preceding completion of the FAFSA. And there are times when a family is experiencing some hardship, and there's a specific question on the FAFSA that talks about being a dislocated worker. And I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of what that essentially means. If you're receiving unemployment benefits due to being laid off, that is considered a dislocated worker. If you've gotten laid off and you aren't getting benefits, but you have notice, that's a dislocated worker. If you were self-employed but are now unemployed due to economic conditions or a natural disaster, that's a dislocated worker. The spouse of an active duty military person is considered, who has to relocate, is considered a dislocated worker, as well as the spouse who is no longer married, but was once a homemaker is considered a dislocated worker. So in this section of the FAFSA, if a student is deemed independent based on the information that they provided in the dependency section, they're going to then answer information on household size, number in college, income-based assistance programs such as SNAP. And based on that information, that's how the student's expected family contribution will be derived. That's additional information that's included in that calculation. However, the vast majority of our students graduating from high school are going to be our students who are dependent. So there's going to be another section that's going to include parental demographic information and parental financial information. In the section on schools, the student can indicate up to 10 schools that they want to receive the results of their FAFSA. So they want to make sure that they include all of those schools that they're interested in. Once you have done that, if there are more than 10 schools, once those schools get the information, the student can then go in, make a correction, and add additional schools and take some off. But initially, the student can add up to 10 schools. And then you're going to also complete the FAFSA with your signature. Again, I'm going to encourage you to do the FSA ID versus the paper signature. Just some things that are a little bit different when it comes to the FAFSA. There are some questions that are no longer on the FAFSA effective last year. When you do the FAFSA, you include your role. So whether you're the student, the parent, or the preparer. Students who don't use the IRS data retrieval tool, and I'm going to encourage our students and families to use the data retrieval tool. That's a tool that allows the student or the tax filer, whomever the tax filer is, to leave the FAFSA website for a brief moment and import all of your tax information directly onto the FAFSA. The reason why I would encourage you to do that is there is no fee for the FAFSA. I just want to make sure I saw that. That's one of the things I like to say. The FAFSA, the first word in FAFSA is free. Please never pay to get it done. So essentially, when it comes to completing the FAFSA, you want to make sure you go ahead and use that data retrieval tool. It will reduce errors and reduce the likelihood of you being selected for a process called verification that I'll go over a little bit later in the presentation. So some schools have what they call a institutional application or also require the CSS profile. This is not in lieu of the FAFSA. This is in addition to the FAFSA. The CSS profile is specifically for private institutions, and they use it to determine financial need for institutional aid. If you're looking at some private institutions, some that come to mind that I know utilize the CSS profile, my colleague at the University of Miami, he has the CSS profile. He utilizes that to determine their institutional aid. I believe other private institutions throughout the state may utilize the CSS profile. I know that a lot of private institutions outside of Florida definitely utilize the CSS profile. So if your student is looking at attending a private institution, you want to make sure you're doing all the necessary applications. I want to talk about the type of aid available to students. So we talked about the FAFSA. The FAFSA is an annual form that you're going to do each and every year. We talked a little bit about the CSS profile, which is going to be a form you're only going to do if you're attending a private institution, and that private institution requires it. But the whole reason for doing any of this is to figure out what type of aid do I qualify to receive. And so I like to split aid into two categories. We like to call free money to assist students with educational expenses, gift aid in financial aid. And it's gift aid because it doesn't require repayment and the student doesn't require employment. So the type of aid that falls into gift aid are grants and scholarships primarily, and scholarships come from a variety of different sources. Federal, state, institutional, and private sources can give grants and or scholarships. But then the other type of aid is called self-help. And self-help is just that. The student is taking action to assist with their educational expenses. So the student is either working in a student employment program, such as the Federal Work Study Program, or taking student loans that require repayment. And so I want to talk a little bit about scholarships and where they come from. Scholarships, as I mentioned, come from a variety of sources. Institutional scholarships are scholarships that the school give out. That school is going to give out institutional scholarships typically based on a variety of factors. For admission purposes, students are going to be going through a process of review through the admission process. And some schools during that process will offer admission scholarships to students. Other schools have a separate scholarship application process. Based on the schools your student is interested in attending, you want to know what that school's process may be. The other thing I would share is that there are a lot of scholarships in the community. And I do know that I'm seeing some parents ask when you should apply for the FAFSA. So while you shouldn't do the FAFSA until your student's senior year, you can start applying for scholarships really early in this process. There are some scholarships available as early as middle school. So if there's a scholarship that does not require that a student be a senior or in college at the time of application, I would encourage students to apply for those scholarships. And there are scholarships throughout the community, our Rotary clubs, our civic organizations, fraternities and sororities, church groups. There's so many different places where you may find scholarship opportunities, and I encourage students to take advantage of those opportunities. To my knowledge, most schools have what we call a foundation. That foundation is what the whole point of the foundation is, to go out into the community and generate resources, financial resources to help students. So that foundation typically has donor scholarships. So depending on where your student is going to school, they need to find out how they tap into that foundation money. Where do they do the application? What's the process like at that particular school? At UCF, we have a one-page application called Access to Opportunities, and it launches annually, and it connects students to various scholarship opportunities. So wherever a student may go to school, they want to find out how they find out about scholarships at that particular school. And then state scholarships. The most common state scholarship is our Bright Futures Scholarship, and we will definitely go into looking at the Bright Futures Scholarship in a moment. But I also wanted to share just where you can find some other private scholarship opportunities. Chegg.com /scholarships, scholarships.com, capex.com /scholarships, FastWeb, as well as the school's scholarship listing. So whatever school your student is choosing to attend, typically their financial aid office has a scholarship webpage, and that student should visit it so that they can learn where they find scholarships there. So just some scholarship search tips. I know I'm probably talking mostly to parents, but I would love for you to convey this to your students. They want to make sure that they apply early, meaning that they meet the scholarship deadline. I know that for us, if you don't meet the deadline, your application does not get reviewed. Quite often, a student should apply for any and all scholarships for which they meet the criteria. That is going to increase the likelihood of the student actually getting scholarships. Get involved. Our students are multifaceted and multi-talented, and while academics often play a role in scholarships, that's not the only factor. A lot of scholarship donors are looking to see that our students are well-rounded, that they are cultivating their interests, that they are good Samaritans and dedicated to the community. So being involved shows a scholarship donor that the student is a well-rounded student, and the student is really honing in on how they can be the best version of themselves. Complete the FAFSA. Even if you don't think you're going to qualify for need-based aid, some scholarships that are not need-based do request that the FAFSA is completed. I'm going to reiterate, the FAFSA is a free application. Doing it does not commit you to anything other than the evaluation of determining the type of aid for which you qualify. So some essay tips for our students. I encourage students to create a scholarship template. What that essentially is just a few paragraphs about that student, the things they're interested in, any awards they've received, and that template would serve as the base for any essay that the student writes. I also tell students to create a scholarship resume. A lot of these students are so incredibly active. It's easy for them to forget all of the great things that they do. Also, sometimes it's hard for each of us to pat ourselves on the back and toot our own horn. So I just like for students to have that resume. It really helps for them to be able to dig in and start to write that essay. And then we want to make sure our students are reading the question and answering the question that was posed. And they want to tell a story that is uplifting and unique, that makes them stand out from the crowd, but they definitely want to make sure they double check for spelling and grammar. We want our students to look for scholarships regularly. I tell students look for scholarships at least every other week. I'll tell a quick story of a student who every Saturday, he made it his business to look for scholarships. He was a stellar student with I believe a 3.8 GPA and a a great major, but this student was able to garner over $60,000 in scholarships by making that kind of like his job. So we want our students to create a file that's dedicated to their scholarships that include their scholarship resume, any essays, any letter of recommendations, letter of purpose, letter of or transcripts. These are all things that they can use to move forward. And they want to stand out. So let's talk about Bright Futures. So Bright Futures is our state-funded scholarship. Based on the tier that a student is eligible to receive, Bright Futures will either cover 100% of the cost per credit hour at our state universities, or 75% of the cost per credit hours at our state universities. Both Bright Futures programs will cover summer courses, and there are specific requirements for our students to be eligible to receive Bright Futures. And so that includes graduating from a public school in the state of Florida, or from a registered private high school, or they can have earned a GED or completed the home education program, or graduated from a non-Florida high school. Typically, a graduate from a non-Florida high school doesn't always qualify. So I would go with the first few that I listed there. The student does have to complete their high school coursework and earn their diploma, achieve the minimum high school grade point average that is listed here. That is a 3.0 for our medallion scholars and a 3.5 for our academic scholars. And our students must maintain the minimum score for our college entrance exams. So for the academic scholars, we're looking for a 29 or a 1330. So a 29 on the ACT or a 1330 on the SAT. For our medallion scholars, we're looking at a 25 on the ACT or a 1210 on the SAT. So I always encourage students looking for the Bright Futures to take both tests, because the tests are different, and some students test differently with the ACT than they do the SAT, scoring slightly higher on one or the other. So I would encourage students looking to optimize, one, their college admissions viability, as well as their Bright Futures viability, to take both tests. Really quickly, I wanted to show you where your students are going to complete their Florida financial aid application. This is a one-time application that our students complete during their senior year. Many students complete it in school, and parents never see it because it happens with the guidance counselor or in their senior English class or at some type of senior seminar. Orange County is amazing at getting students to get this done. So this application is required for students to be considered for Bright Futures. So we want to make sure that our students get this done in their senior year. There is another Bright Futures scholarship. It's called Gold Seal or Gold Seal Cape Scholarship. And this scholarship is for our students who are considering vocational education. So this scholarship is not taken at our state universities. However, some of our state colleges, depending on the type of program the student is pursuing, may take the Gold Seal Vocational Scholarship. And it has different requirements. It requires different coursework. It has a different GPA requirement. You must have the Florida financial aid application on file. Students must have a weighted GPA of a 3.0 in their non-elective high school courses. They must take at least 3 full credits in a single career or technical education program, achieve a minimum unweighted GPA of a 3.5 in those career courses, complete 30 service hours, and achieve the required minimum score on the entrance exams below. What I would also say is that when it comes to Bright Futures, you also have to ensure that you are doing your community service. And that's 100 hours for the academic and 75 for the merit. Really quickly, for your student to continue to receive Bright Futures, once in college, they must maintain a 3.0 to be awarded at the academic level and a 2.75 to be awarded at the medallion level. But don't want you all to get scammed. So I did see the question about whether or not the FAFSA is free. The FAFSA is definitely free. You also don't want to pay for scholarship searches unnecessarily. There are many options for free scholarship searches. You want to utilize your campus-based resources, speak with your financial aid advisors, speak with your guidance counselors. If anyone is saying, I can absolutely positively receive the get you scholarships, then you want to make sure that you take into account that that's probably not true. There aren't many people who can guarantee you a scholarship, so be very wary of that. And then, if possible, avoid giving personal information. I'm going to segue into grants. Grants are going to be based on your expected family contribution in most cases. The Pell Grant is the most common grant, is a federal grant. It's going to be based on the student's enrollment as well as the student's expected family contribution. Really quickly, I wanted to give an example of why filing by the priority filing date is really important. So I'll give an example of a student who has a 0 EFC at the University of Central Florida. If that student has a 0 expected family contribution, that student would be eligible for the Pell Grant. In addition to being eligible for the Pell Grant, if that student files by our priority filing date, that student would be considered for the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, as well as the Florida Student Assistance Grant, which is in total about over $3,000 for the academic year. So that being said, I just wanted to drive home the reason why I encourage families to complete the FAFSA as early as possible. The Pell Grant does, you don't have to have a 0 EFC to get Pell Grant. There is a range, but just to share with you, these are some of the things that are really important when it comes to filing by your school's priority filing date. The Florida Department of Education also does offer a specific grant called the EASE Grant. The EASE Grant is available to students who are attending a private university or college here in the state of Florida, and it's to alleviate some of those costs. This is not a need-based grant per se. However, if you're going to a private institution, you do want to speak with that school about how you go through the process of being evaluated for the EASE Grant. Work Study is a program that allows students to earn a biweekly paycheck as a part of their financial aid package, so the student gets paid every other week. When the FAFSA is completed, the student can indicate whether the student is interested in being considered for Work Study. Work Study is another limited program, so not all interested students may receive this, but if a student is offered Work Study and would like to take advantage of this federal financial aid program, then the student would want to make sure that they know the process at their particular school, how they find a job, how they get started, and so forth. So a little bit on student loans. In terms of student loans, there are the non-credit-based federally funded student loans available to assist students with their educational expenses based on their dependency status. In terms of federal loans, there's also the credit-based Parent Plus loan that allows parents of undergraduate students to borrow up to their students' cost of attendance at a particular institution minus the amount of financial aid that the student is receiving. Graduate students may also borrow the Graduate Plus loan, but I'm not going to get too much into that right now. There are also private educational loans. Private educational loans vary by lender, and they are credit required. Many of our students coming out of high school don't necessarily have the credit history for private educational loans. So what we would want in that case, if a student is considering that, the lender may consider asking for a cosigner. I just like to share with parents and students the amount a student can borrow based on their academic classification. So a freshman, regardless of where they are attending school in the great United States, can borrow a total of $5,500 for the academic year. If that student has need, $3,500 of that can be the subsidized loan. But it's really important to just kind of drive home that the loan has a cap. And the reason I share that is because as students are making decisions, you're comparing award letters, you're looking at cost of attendance, there's only so much a student can borrow on the federal loan. So some tips for reducing student loan debt. We want our students to complete the FAFSA each and every year. We want them to create a budget each semester so that they know what's coming in and what's going out. We only want them to borrow if needed and only borrow the amount that they need. If a student has an unsubsidized loan, we want them to pay the interest on the unsubsidized loan if they can. That will reduce the principal balance ultimately, because what happens with that interest is it capitalizes and compounds, so it gets added to what the student owes, so the student ends up having a larger balance when they graduate. So if they can pay that quarterly. And then they want to apply for scholarships as often as possible. Free money is good money. And a couple more things. I mentioned special circumstances. We recognize the FAFSA does not always capture everything that a family may be going through, and things can change. It is information from 2 years ago. A family could have a change of their household size. Unfortunately, maybe someone has passed away, or there's a change in marital status in the home. Maybe there's loss of income or employment. These are things that we can take into account through a process called professional judgment. Also, I mentioned those items that make a student dependent or independent, I should say, for financial aid purposes. However, I also mentioned there are times that we recognize a student doesn't fall neatly into one of those categories, but may have a more complicated family situation. If a student has been abandoned or abused, or is in a custodial situation that may not be legally established, then that student could go through what we call the dependency override process. And that's done at the school level. I quickly mentioned verification when I was talking about the data retrieval tool. Verification, if you're selected for this process, you will be required to submit documentation to your Office of Student Financial Assistance, and that information is going to be cross-referenced against the information you've provided on the FAFSA. And then just really quickly, each school has what we call satisfactory academic progress, or SAP, and renewal criteria for receiving aid varies from school to school. So you want your students to learn what that criteria is. And also some grants and some scholarships, I briefly went over Bright Teachers, have specific renewal criteria, and we want to make sure our students know that. And then I am an advocate for higher education. I don't think I shared this with you all, but I bleed black and gold, but the information that I share is for you all to take to wherever your student chooses to go to school. I am 3 times a night, but wherever they choose to go, I hope that the information that I've shared tonight is something that they can take with them wherever they go. I am going to stop my share and open up the floor for any questions that did not get answered while I was presenting.
Okay, wonderful. So we do have some questions that have come up, okay? And so I'm gonna share with you just some of the big ones that came up here. One is if a student is a non-resident, can they still apply for financial aid?
Yes. If a student is a non-resident, they can still apply for financial aid. They may not get state-funded programs, but they can apply for financial aid. The FAFSA is a federal application. And so what the FAFSA is going to do is determine the type of federal aid for which a student qualifies, and in some cases, the type of institutional aid for which a student qualifies. The other thing I would say in regards to a student being a non-resident and doing the process is then you're gonna really wanna try to find where you can get those free dollars, because in the state of Florida, for our state institutions, there is a difference in the tuition for our in-state students versus our out-of-state students.
Okay. There was another question here about how quickly after they've submitted the FAFSA will they be able to find out how much financial aid they're eligible for?
That's a great question. It really depends on the time of year. I'm gonna be honest. If you're doing it now in October, you're gonna get your student aid report. Your student aid report will tell you if, based on the information provided on the FAFSA, if you appear eligible for the Pell Grant. And
Mhm.
but you won't get your actual financial aid summary, is what we refer to it at UCF. Some people call it the financial aid offer letter.
Mhm.
A little bit later. So most schools start to send those out between February and April, depending on the institution. And so for that is going to be a more detailed explanation of the type of aid you're getting at that particular institution. And
Okay.
so where we want our students to start comparing their cost of attendance at those institutions, the amount of gift aid they're getting at those schools, so that they can see what their net costs are at a particular school.
Okay. I also have a question. We've actually had a few questions about if I do not have a any income, what happens? Do I report nothing on the FAFSA, or kind of what does that look like?
So if there is no income, what essentially will happen is you would put those zeros. Anywhere there isn't a value, you're going to put zeros, and that's okay. I will share that there may be times that additional documentation is necessary if the information on the FAFSA doesn't necessarily reflect how maybe a family of that size was able to sustain itself. So if the income is zero and there aren't other resources, it may be possible that the institution may ask additional questions. I just wanted.
Okay, no problem. And then we have a couple parents who are in a situation where they have split custody, but they have equal, it's 50-50. So in a situation like that, how do they determine which person goes on the taxes?
So it's not necessarily on the taxes. It's really on the FAFSA. So
Or on the
what,
FAFSA, I apologize.
right? So in that particular case, I would share with students and families that they would want to more than likely use the parent if there is a parent that provided more financial support. That would be more in line with what the federal government would want you to utilize. Quite frankly, in the 24-25 cycle, it's not going to be the custodial parent, it is going to be the parent who provided more financial support. So that would be the second tier. And if the parents provide equal financial support and have equal custody, then the student could choose which parent.
Okay. All right. A couple really specific questions, but I'm sure it applies to more than one person on this call. Are super scores accepted?
Yes.
So yes. Okay. Well, there you go. That was the first time I'd heard that one. Then
Yeah,
we have a couple about a stepfather or a roommate, anybody who you're living with who you're not that hasn't adopted your child. Do they need to report their income on the FAFSA?
stepfather or stepmother, yes. A
Okay.
stepfather mother is considered information that we need to know. A roommate would be no. So it really depends on the situation. So if the
Okay.
parent is married, then no. If the parent has remarried, yes, they have to include the information. If the parent has someone who cohabitates with them that is not their spouse, that is different.
Right. Okay. So if you have a roommate or, you're renting out a room or any of those sorts of things, that income is not needed, but only if you are married or you've adopted that child, that would be important. There was another question again about the non-residents. So there's a few different kind of versions of this question. One is, do students that are TPS or have temporarily protected status, are they eligible to apply for the FAFSA? And then kind of a different variety of that question is about students and or parents who are here with a green card. Can you address that again?
Sure. So students or parents who are permanent residents, well, let me even back up. The student who is a permanent resident and who possesses a permanent resident card is considered an eligible non-citizen. So that person is eligible to receive federally funded aid as long as they meet all of the other criteria. And that student is also allowed to complete the FAFSA. Unfortunately, our TPS and DACA students are not eligible for federally funded aid. And so I do want to share, though, a resource that is available to students who fall into the TPS and or DACA category.
Okay.
And that is the dream.us. So the dream.us, and I can, in a moment, I'll try to pull that up for you all. And the dream.us is a scholarship foundation dedicated to assisting DACA and TPS students. The other thing I will say is, honestly, in the state of Florida, what an institution can do is limited for our undocumented students as well. And so what I would share is that if there's ever a private entity that doesn't specify that a student has to be a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, the student should look for as much private funding as possible. And there are some private loans available, but also private scholarships. That's where I would emphasize that our students who may be classified as TPS or DACA should.
Okay. So if I'm a senior parent this year and I'm ready to have my child go to school in the fall and I'm ready to do the FAFSA tomorrow, but I haven't done my taxes yet for 2022. Is this a problem or can I use the numbers from last year? What am I supposed to do?
So it is not a problem at all. Because remember, the FAFSA for this year is using tax information from 2020. So
Okay.
The FAFSA launched on October 1st. It's using 2021. So essentially what that means is that hopefully you've already filed and you have that ready to go. We're beyond 2021 extensions, so I hope you filed and you're able to go ahead and get the FAFSA done.
Okay, awesome.
Parents
Can
who
you make
haven't filed,
changes?
I'm sorry.
Can you make changes to the FAFSA after
Yeah,
you've submitted it?
absolutely. And I was going to kind of elaborate on what I just said. If by chance a family hasn't filed 2021, and they can then use the best information they have at the time and input that information on the FAFSA and then make the appropriate changes at a later date.
Okay. What if
And
a
families,
parent has unemployment or disability? How does that factor into all of this? Do they report that as income or how do they
differently.
deal with that?
So disability, it really depends on whether it's taxable.
Mhm.
So if there is taxable SSI, sometimes that gets a little bit tricky. But SSI can be excluded as income on the FAFSA. Unemployment is not.
Okay. So unemployment we report, depending on the disability situation, it's kind of a maybe. Okay. Still I see some questions about separated families. So again, guys, I just want to reiterate that if you are in a situation where you are divorced, right? And you are not living with the parent, it's going to be the parent who is the majority of the time. That's who would you report on the FAFSA. If it's 50-50 time, the advice given was the parent with the greater income is who we would report. If you were, what about if you were never married?
It's still the custodial parent.
So the custodial parent. So there you go,
Married,
guys. Okay.
yeah, it's still the custodial parent unless there's a there can still be, I guess, a 50-50 situation. It might not be legal, but if the student spends exactly 50% of the student's time with one parent and exactly 50% of the student's time with another parent, then we would go with the parent that provides the most financial support.
So this is interesting. What if I have a parent who's recently deceased? Do I need to report any information about them?
It's a good question. Typically, once someone has passed away, you indicate that on the FAFSA and they wouldn't request the information.
Okay, great.
Chance that happens after the FAFSA has been submitted,
Mhm.
that that's where that special circumstance process comes into play, and then that person's information can be removed
Okay.
um, to reflect the family's current situation.
Okay. A couple of interesting questions. What if I'm taking a gap year? Do I fill out the FAFSA this year or do I wait till I come back? What do I do?
Great question. A lot of my answers are going to be it depends. So it on when you plan to come back to school. So as I mentioned when I was speaking earlier, let's say you've taken a gap, but you're coming back summer of that next year, I would go ahead and get the FAFSA done so it's on file. And when you get to school in summer of 2024, it sounds so far away, then your FAFSA was already on file. Also, there's no harm or foul in doing the FAFSA. If you don't attend, then you just don't, the aid doesn't get processed. So I would go ahead and get it done. But you don't, I mean, if you're not going to be there, you're not going to be there. You already know that. But plans change, things change. So I would just say go ahead and get it done. No harm, no foul.
So we have some twin parents. So what if I have twins? How do I simultaneously report my income for both and how does the government know they're twins?
We won't know that they're twins per se. What we will know is that you have two students in college. So that's part of the information inputted on the FAFSA. And so when a parent inputs the information of the number of students in college, then that is taken into account in the expected family contribution calculation.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So I do see a question that just popped up. Do you need to be working to fill out the FAFSA? So the answer to that is no, right? You're just reporting
No,
your income, whether that's zero or
correct.
$1 million, you're reporting whatever it
You're
is.
reporting
Okay.
exactly what you have. And there is no I do think I saw a number about income cap. There
Mhm.
isn't really there's so many factors that go into determining the expected family contribution. All those factors are taken into account. I will share candidly and openly that for a lot of families, the expected family contribution, quite frankly, I'm a straight shooter, doesn't feel realistic.
Right.
And so I think that's when our families have to look at what are the other resources available to you. How do I maximize my scholarship potential? Do I need to tap into the parent loan program? How do I navigate what's our situation?
Do they take into account not, I'm a straight shooter too. I have four daughters, a freshman, a junior, a kindergartner, and a sophomore in college. God help me. So Do they take into account if a parent, and this was one of the questions that came up, is also paying off their own student loans, or maybe the parent is also in college for some reason?
So that's a great question. And so, no. That um the parent, and I'm going to tell you a couple of layers. When it comes to the household obligations, there is a formula that's taken into account within the expected family contribution calculation that accounts for a variety of different expenses. So that's already like kind of done in the methodology. When it
Mhm.
comes to being in college, the FAFSA does not currently take that into account. However, through the special circumstance process, depending on the institution, so let me tell you about the special circumstance. It really is institution by institution. We're given leverage to exercise our professional judgment. Different schools do that differently. But a parent could say, I'm also in college. Can that be considered? And that school might have a process to consider the parent through that special circumstance or professional judgment process, but the FAFSA does not initially consider it.
So that's great information though, parents, because for example, my daughter's transferring to UCF in the fall. I might also be
Right.
going to graduate school at UCF at the same time. That's a great opportunity to contact the college and let them know about that special circumstance. So we
Correct. And that's
also,
for now. I do want this caveat. A lot is changing in 24, 25. So for 23, 24 year, that's valid. So we'll cross the changes when we get to it. Next year's
we
session will be really exciting.
I bet. Actually lately every year's legislative session is exciting. So we are have a few questions that I'm excited parents have asked about. One is, can you talk a little bit about the top 10 or something like that night program at UCF? And two is, can you talk about the Talented 20 program and what that means in the state of Florida?
Sure. So both are programs that recognize how a student has performed in high school. And they are programs of recognition. And I want to make that clear because I think there's often a thought that there's always money that comes with that recognition. There isn't always funding that comes with that recognition. So I wanted to be very true to myself and my straight shooter nature and share that we are commending your students because these are great accomplishments, but they are recognitions. They are not necessarily scholarship programs. So that's what I would share.
And so just so if you're not familiar with the program at all, right, the Talented 20 is talking about students who are in the top 20% of their class can be guaranteed admission to a Florida college or university, not necessarily the first one of their choosing,
Not
right?
one of the choice.
Um,
Right.
but again, if your child is in that top 20%, absolutely an amazing opportunity to be guaranteed a way to go to college, but not necessarily tied to financial aid. So super important to understand that. There is a question again about the Dream website. What was the
Yep. I'm
website?
pulling it up right now. I saw that. So one moment. Let me go ahead and share that in the chat.
And then there was another question if you might be able to share the UCF college ID number. And then we have another question, which I think is a great one because I know my junior's in this situation. She's not sure what school she wants to go to yet. And
Mhm.
so on the FAFSA, does she just put nothing? Does she just pick her local school? What's the right way to handle that?
So right now she wouldn't be doing a FAFSA just yet because she's
Mhm.
right. So for our seniors, they want to put any school that they may be interested in attending. So you want to get it out there, even if you're not. And again, you can put up to 10 schools. So you don't have to be certain. You just need to know, these are the 10 schools I'm interested in attending and get that information to those schools. Um, because again, that priority filing date can be such a major factor in the type of aid a student receives. I just included the dream.us website in the chat. And again, this is specifically for our undocumented students. It is a scholarship opportunity for those students. They must attend a partner institution. It provides them with resources. And again, I just want to reiterate for our students who are undocumented, if a scholarship is a private scholarship and it does not specify that is for a citizen or eligible non-citizen, put your name in that.
Okay. So a few additional questions here. So, guys, I'm running through the ones at the end here. Do you need to apply for the FAFSA of the university you plan to go to? No, you can list up to 10 universities. How do you apply for Bright Futures? You have up until August 31st of the August after your child graduates. I know there were some people worried about that. I just posted the link there. You're going to apply at floridastudentfinancialaid.org. Many high schools help students through this process, but definitely make sure that you've done that. Um, there was a few questions about the SAT scores needed. Guys, you will see that in the PowerPoint when we send it, but it is currently a 1330 for 100% and a 1210 for 75%. And then there was a question about asylum seekers and whether or not they can be admitted to state universities.
It depends.
That's beyond my
Not
skill set.
right. That is normally not taken into consideration in the admission process. What I will say is, I thought the person also asked, can they apply for the FAFSA? If the asylee status has been granted, then they are considered an eligible non-citizen. If it is still pending, then until that status updates to a granted status, the student wouldn't be considered for federal aid.
Okay. Lots of questions about the FAFSA in the junior year. No, everybody, you're going to do that in your senior year, but you might be wondering why we invited junior parents. Well, for a really good reason, which is that you have to start planning for paying for college way in advance. And you're going to want to make sure you get your taxes done this year because that's the one you're going to use in the fall to be able to get your FAFSA done during that senior year. So that's really important to be aware of what's going on there. There is a question here again about separated families, and I think our family's blended as well, so I can understand this question. This is the parent is divorced, they've been remarried, but the stepfather isn't in reality responsible for the family. Do they still
Understood.
need to report their income?
They
They
do.
do.
They do. And human to human, person to person, I understand that. In terms of what the FAFSA requires, step parent information is required.
Yeah, and I'm a step parent, so I get that. So I have reported my own information in that same case. Question here about residency, which you may or may not be able to answer, but if your child has attended a high school during their senior year, would they automatically be considered a Florida resident?
Not necessarily. And I'm going to be very clear that residency is not a function of financial aid. So I don't want to misspeak, but there are a variety of different documents that a student and a family must include in order to establish the student's residency for tuition purposes. And so the length of time the student has been in the state of Florida is one of the factors, but there are a variety of other factors that are included in order to determine the student's residency status for financial aid purposes.
Okay, great question here that I haven't seen before. This parent has a child who's currently using a McKay scholarship for a 504. Is there something similar to that at the college level?
I saw that question, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. What I will share is that when it comes to accommodations at the college level, there is normally a department that handles the accommodations for our students at college. I have not processed any specific scholarships for our students who are getting accessibility accommodations per se. That does not mean that there aren't private scholarships available for students with specific needs. So that's how I would answer that. I don't think we have a McKay scholarship extension beyond
Okay.
12 system.
Okay, awesome. Um, there is lots of questions about your PowerPoint. Guys, we will make sure to get that
I
to
will
you
get
in
it.
24 hours. We know that everybody is so excited about the information that you've shared, and we are so thankful that she was able to share such thorough information. If you are not clear about any of these questions and you need additional information, please know you can always reach out to your child's high school, college, and career counselor. There is one at every single high school. You can just call the front office, they can connect you to them. There is also your student's guidance counselor that can help you walk through this process. There were several questions that I just saw pop up in the last 2 minutes about adopted children and their benefits in the state of Florida. Would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, I can briefly talk about that. The benefits for the waiver in the state of Florida, I will be candid, that's not actually processed by financial aid. While it's a financial resource, it's processed through our student account services office. And that office takes the information from the student and then applies the appropriate tuition waiver.
And I did post that link earlier in the chat. I'll repost it for you guys so you can see all of the benefits that come with adopting a child in the state of Florida. And as she said, that's basically a waiver. So it's almost like I think about it like a coupon code. When you get your financial fee statement, there's going
It's
to
gonna
be kind of that deduction, and it just says, we're not doing this anymore. So it's not a scholarship, it's more of a true waiver. Okay.
correct.
This is a great question. Is if I know my child's financial situation is going to change or my financial situation is going to change in the next 6 months, would that fall under that kind of unexpected situation?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. What would happen is they would still report the information, and then
Mhm.
after they report the information, they would do the professional judgment or the special circumstance at that school.
Okay. And then the last question that I see here is about military families, where I have families where one spouse is serving overseas or isn't in the country at all. How do they go about reporting on the FAFSA, or do they just treat that as a normal circumstance?
If that family is married, if it's a married couple, they complete just as though that person was in the home.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, guys, I want to take a moment to thank Dr. Mansell. She has been so kind. We are past our time, and she has answered, I think, maybe hundreds of questions. We are going to compile all of the questions that were asked today into a frequently asked questions document, and we will send that back out to everybody that was on the call with a copy of the PowerPoint and certainly the information about all of the OCPS college and career counselors for each high school, so you know who you can contact to help your child get the best possible chance they can at moving forward after graduation in a successful way for your family. We do want you to know that we have additional opportunities available for families to attend more parent academies. Those opportunities are available at parentacademy.ocps.net, and all of our parent academies are recorded, and the recordings can be found on the OCPS Families YouTube channel. So you can see all of this and be able to reference it afterwards there. If you are a family of a student who participates in the Exceptional Student Education Program, I also want to let you know that there is a special Big Idea ESE Parent Academy Conference coming up on Saturday, October 15th, which will also have a few sessions that deal with transitioning from the high school setting to the post-secondary setting. And that may address some of the questions here from the McKay Scholarship perspective, etc. But thank you all again, and we hope to see you very soon at the next Parent Academy. Have a great night, Dr.
Everyone.
Vincent.
You too.